1911 site plan for the exposition. As part of their contract, the Olmsted Brothers' responsibilities would include the landscape design, as well as the style, general character, sizing, and siting of the buildings. So this location here would be close to public transit and be axial through the flat area of the site. And as the site becomes more steep, the design would nestle into the topography and have bridges over those valleys. So it was definitely a conscious effort to preserve the existing landscape and to minimize grading. Large turf lawns were deemed inappropriate due to their high water use and maintenance. The nominal use of water would be used within the exposition grounds, and in other areas rely on just dry farming or using only natural rainfall and fog as the irrigation for the majority of the park. The landscape architect Samuel Parsons had made the same decision in his earlier designs for the site. In 1905, Parsons had completed an earlier design for all 1,400 acres. And like Olmsted Sr., for whom Parsons worked at Central Park, Parsons was determined not to repeat a formulaic approach to park design, but really adapt the designs to this new semi-arid condition of the West. For example, where ground covers were needed, Parsons substituted native grasses and vines, ice plant. Other mitigating designs included terracing the steep slopes as the most efficient way to minimize runoff. The architect chosen for this exhibition was San Diego resident Irving Gill, who had a very modernist style, as can be seen in this final bridge design here. Having worked with Gill on the new town of Torrance in the Los Angeles area, the Olmsted brothers did not really like his style, and they asked the fair organizers to hire the architect Bertram Goodhue as its principal architect. However, Goodhue's training in Beaux-Arts layout of buildings was inconsistent with nestling them into the landscape. Rather, he wanted the layout of the buildings to be one long axis and recommended moving the fair location to the middle of the site where this could be resolved. The developer, John Spreckles, who we see over here, owned and controlled many things in San Diego with a monopoly on transportation and the newspapers. He had been privately buying vacant land on the north side of the 1,400 acres for future development. And as one of its key financiers of the project, he knew that a road to the middle of the site could, after the fair, be continued to his properties. And he withheld financing until the project site was moved. Believing that the new fair location would ruin the site, the Olmsted brothers resigned and returned to Massachusetts. With the new designers, they'd returned to an English pastoral design with high water use. What was built was water intensive and spread the word that anything can grow in California if you have enough water. The Olmsted brothers' vision of a new park typology for Southern California, that of a yellow native landscape as an appropriate model, would not be accepted until it is barely accepted now in the 21st century. For much of the 20th century, the idea of a park with lots of green lawn would remain the model. And if we look at this aerial of Balboa Park, as Spreckles predicted, the road into the park continued later and today splits the park in half. Another idea I want to talk about is the idea of developing new towns. And in that development, thinking about building it around natural systems with the focus on walkability and outdoor recreation. At 16,000 acres, Palos Verdes Estates was the largest new town designed in the 1920s, and the Olmsted brothers would remain on this project for over 20 years. Located in South Los Angeles County on a peninsula, here between Redondo Beach and San Pedro, here's Long Beach over here. It was also located near Torrance, which they had designed, which is over here, and was a familiar location for the firm. So this is the peninsula with the roads being laid out in Palos Verdes, and Torrance is going to be over here, another project of theirs. This is La Venta Inn and was the first building built, aptly the sales office. The developer was a New York banker named Frank Vanderlip, and he had a syndicate who purchased the property for its spectacular ocean views. Here we're looking at Malibu, if you've ever been up in Palos Verdes. From the onset, the city was conceived as a totally planned community. Its design developed by the Olmsted Brothers as the directors of design, along with city planner Charles Chaney and architect Myron Hunt. It was eventually known as the Palos Verdes Project, and it was developed during a critical period of regionalism when designers were asking, what should design look like in Southern California? Following on the heels of their San Diego research, there were similarities with Palos Verdes. It was also a Mediterranean climate and was largely undeveloped by the 1900s. The site had been used for ranching with farming on the west coastal edge. So you can see this kind of denuded landscape because of the years of being a ranch. Prior to any design, the Olmsted firm conducted meticulous ecological research on the site. In 1914, Olmsted principal Fred Dawson contacted Los Angeles forester Dr. Ford Ashman Carpenter to compile a climatological survey of the Palos Verdes Rancho. Carpenter would set up a series of stations throughout the 16,000 acres and record the weather through thermometers, rain gauges, and hygrometers to provide climate information to the firm so that they could consider whether to use wind power or to know exact precipitation rates. A topographical survey was also developed with precision, and these contour lines that they wanted were at 5-foot intervals, which is really small. Remember that at this time, the firm was still designing the road system from Brookline, and they had not yet opened their California office, so they really needed this meticulous topography map to guide the roads. In initial site research, they also did exhaustive hydrology and microclimate studies. The firm contacted Theodore Payne once again, and Payne advised on plants that needed low amounts of water, both California natives and Mediterranean-based plants. By 1915, an on-site nursery was established to propagate plants for the new town. Realizing that most new residents to California would be unaware of native and hardy plants to plant in Palos Verdes, the home sites were often pre-planted with ornamental and fruit trees. Lawns would be very small and often located in courtyards rather than the typical front yard design found throughout the United States at the time. And when you're looking at this, this is in Lanada Bay in that part of Palos Verdes, they were growing in the 10,000s of amounts of plants. So huge amount of propagation taking place. As part of the research, in order to lay out new roads, Fred Dawson requested the plans for proposed and existing boulevards between Los Angeles and San Pedro from the County Highway Commission in order to weave Palos Verdes' new system of roads into existing ones. I know this sounds strange, but at the time, Los Angeles was being developed without a master plan. So housing was being built with roads that did not connect to existing ones. And the complex street system at Palos Verdes was designed to follow the contours of 7 major geological terraces of the peninsula, streets being laid, as you can see here, where grading was possible, reducing ugly cuts and fills while providing better views from the lots. So you can kind of see how they're going to navigate this topography really gently to get the roads in. Each designer and the developer of Palos Verdes had a specific agenda. So developer Frank Vanderlip envisioned an exclusive residential colony based on Mediterranean design, and it would be responsive to the setting's southern Italian ambiance. His visits to the Sorrentine Peninsula and its Amalfi Drive were reminiscent of this location. Chief architect Myron Hunt made a career of developing a distinct regional style that really matures in the 1920s. The architectural design was defined as California architecture. This is La Venta Inn again right here. And it was an eclectic mix of Italian, Moorish, Spanish, and Mexican designs. For all the designers, the new city would be influenced by both the existing landscape and climatically similar forms of urban design. So comparing the built design of Palos Verdes to this historic southern Italian town of Ravello, we see a similar form of architecture, but also the way the buildings hug the steep site. At the same time, city planner Charles Chaney used Mediterranean prototypes in the villages at Palos Verdes, but he blended them with American planning models. Buildings would have long stucco facades with arcades for shade in a U-shaped layout around a plaza. What is American, however, is that rather than being a pedestrian plaza, as would have been the case in Europe, here those spaces were used for parking lots. Not only were the Olmsted brothers the designer, but they were community members as well. In a contractual agreement with developer Frank Vanderlip, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and Fred Dawson were required to live in Palos Verdes while it was under construction. So through this residence, the firm was able not only to influence the community's taste and control the long-term development of the city, but also combine their professional and personal values into the design. This is Frederick Law Olmsted's house right here, with beautiful views onto the ocean. This is the plan for Olmsted and his family's home in Palos Verdes. So you entered the site through this long drive, passing by an orchard and a vegetable garden. If you're walking into the site, you would enter through this long flower border that was designed to look like those by English landscape designer Gertrude Jekyll. Myron Hunt designed the home in a layout similar to Mexican adobes, where you have a singular linear group of rooms to promote airflow. So a small lawn was included here on the west edge of the property, where it would minimize really the distractions from the panoramic ocean view. Here's some views of that planted border, pretty early view of that. The border was formal in its spatial layout, but informally filled with drought-tolerant plants. And in a regional approach at Palos Verdes, there was a prolific use of locally quarried Palos Verdes stone. This is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. walking down a path at his home, and you can see the Palos Verdes stone. It's a white stone on the walls and also on the path. Here is another view of how much Palos Verdes stone was used throughout that community. In this image of the golf course at Palos Verdes, again on the walls and on the paths. Open space played a special role in the design. It's not located in the undevelopable land. Instead, the design utilized hillsides and shore bluff lots for multi-use. Much of the housing was located on the opposite side of the road to maintain open views of the ocean. Open space was also designed to divert stormwater into the canyons, which we can see here, and other natural drainage channels while maintaining that existing natural landscape. Storm drains are not found in the 1920s development of Palos Verdes because lots and streets were graded to divert stormwater into green spaces, mitigating for heavy rains as seen here. So they're those green spaces that are within each community. Open space, therefore, maintained that natural landscape as an amenity with the additional function of assisting drainage and stormwater recharge. Individual neighborhoods nestled among these greenways, though most people would probably not realize their ecological function of water management. And lastly, planned open space had recreational value, which was always important to Frederick Olmsted Jr., especially in Palos Verdes for hiking and for horseback riding. Not only was the Olmsted firm an expert in the ecology of the region, but as residents, they were also very familiar with its culture. Critical to their plan was an understanding of the car culture of Los Angeles, a city with the highest per capita number of cars in 1920. This image here shows downtown Los Angeles before the invention of stoplights. So complete nightmare trying to get across the road. Prescient planning models were utilized at Palos Verdes, including streets at 200 feet wide to accommodate multiple types of circulation for automobiles, for an electric railway, and pedestrian and equestrian sidewalks. Soils research provided information to them about water permeability. Street plans were designed to manage stormwater, and Olmsted created an additional erosion control measure through native planting, instructing the general contractor to place shrubs and trees at the base of steep slopes or little cliffs, In general, this planting would be, he said, of native sorts that will endure without irrigation after they are established. Palos Verdes' initial development was laid out in 6 principal villages, with each village having its own commercial center and schools. Parkways would then connect the villages into one larger green space, and these included Valmonte, Malaga Cove, Monte Malaga, Margate, Lanada Bay, and Miralest, which is now part of Rancho Palos Verdes because it's not connected to these groups of villages. Village designs looked a lot like today's walkable city, with amenities such as residential, commercial, schools, and parks, all within walking distance of each other. You don't see sidewalks in Palos Verdes because you're supposed to take these trails through that whole community. The planning for Palos Verdes also required the division of residential lots. So the roads followed the topography, which we can see in these curves. And properties are laid out with non-uniform sizes to encourage homeowners to develop their design in a better response to their specific site. Additionally, a requirement of site development reduced the footprint of the building to no greater than 30% of the lot size, increasing open space between homes. The irregular lot layouts too changed the house siding and added character to the streetscape, as all the front doors did not line up as they often do in a gridded lot plan. Because of the steep grade of much of Palos Verdes, many of the original homes required terracing. Imagery like this from the 1920s reflects private homes using those varying elevations as design features, such as up here, with Palos Verdes stone covering the walls and the steps. Responding to this incredible temperate climate, interior courtyards and patios flowed from the buildings as outdoor living rooms. From the beginning, the design was to work with the existing semi-arid climate. These images show the lush landscape design using the right plants for local conditions. Palos Verdes was the largest unirrigated development in the country at the time, fulfilling a firm principle of water-reducing design as an appropriate regional response to the climate. What the firm wasn't able to accomplish in San Diego, they did accomplish at Palos Verdes. Instead of an English picturesque influence typical of most parks, an example here of Farnham Martins Park looked to Moorish design, or design from southern Spain using a Mediterranean prototype. In this park, it's terraced down the slope, creating 3 separate spaces, a circular lawn, and then 2 hardscape areas, you can see here. The stone used is obviously Palos Verdes stone, and the planting design was intended to blur into this borrowed landscape behind it in color and form. And what you see here is a water tower. More examples of lush design. Even the commercial spaces minimize lawn. So there you see very little lawn, even in the business centers. In a critical appreciation of the site, all the designs, the roads, the business centers, the parks, even open space, corresponded to the natural conditions. This connection of all the green spaces, which we're seeing here with golf courses, parks, playgrounds, parkways, is what today we would call green infrastructure. So the word wasn't invented then, but now we use that in planning. That original allocation of open space has been maintained, and there have been some unexpected benefits that came from that. The Palos Verdes blue butterfly, and one of the most rare butterflies in the world, can be found here because its habitat is still intact. The in-depth research that began in San Diego was realized in the Palos Verdes project. Through the developer's support and appreciation of California's native landscape, this client allowed the design of Palos Verdes to showcase ecological urban design in land and water conservation, walkability within cities, as well as plant choices used in commercial and residential design. And though 90 years post-development, historic structures, parks, golf courses, and other amenities have been maintained. While some of you may consider parkways a mundane type of landscape, the Olmsted brothers designed theirs to have multifunction. They were roads that managed stormwater while also linking cultural heritage sites in the region. The Olmsted firm had a long history of designing pleasure drives, beginning with Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and his partner Calvert Vaux at Central Park. For the Boston Park System, or Emerald Necklace, Olmsted Sr. coined the word parkway for a new landscape type. A parkway was a linear park that connected to larger green spaces. So it wasn't what we think of today as a roadway then, but rather a narrow a piece of land as a park to keep you in a park as you went through that whole space. The Seattle Park and Parkway system is the most complete of the Olmsted brothers' designs. Like their father, they continued with the tradition of connecting existing green spaces to new parks with parkways. And in Seattle, this set of red lines is the parkway system. And in this design too, the Olmsted brothers convinced Seattle to start buying the waterways so that those could be protected, which is a pretty good idea for what they got to keep. In Los Angeles, financing for parkways was enabled by the passage of the 1925 Mattoon Act, also known as the Acquisition and Improvement Act. It was a sweeping bill that promised to streamline and provide funding for the construction of needed public works. The act included the right to create what they called improvement districts that crossed city and county lines. Millions of dollars worth of Mattoon Act bonds were soon issued to pay for the construction of thousands of miles of new highways and roads in Southern California. The law was a boon for real estate developers who used those public funds to install street lamps, build parks, and widen and pave roads in their newly subdivided neighborhoods. That same year, the Olmsted brothers were hired to design a series of parkways that would connect from the ocean at Palos Verdes, which is here, to the new business district in Los Angeles. Sepulveda Highway, right here, was an existing street that the Olmsted brothers incorporated into their Hollywood Palos Verdes plan as an improvement. This north-south connector road with an east-west parkway crossed at Avalon Park here in Gardena. Like Palos Verdes, the design of the parkways that would run throughout Los Angeles were very wide at 200 to 400 feet. This allowed for 2 lanes of traffic in the center. They had paths for walking or for bikes. And then they placed service roads on the outside edges for where trucks would drive. Buildings, you can see, were pushed really far back from the road to keep a park-like experience. This drawing shows what that parkway would have looked like with the central area here for cars. This particular drawing is in Palos Verdes, so it shows equestrian trails right here, walking path, and service roads. And while we would probably not plant eucalyptus trees as street trees today, it was a common street tree in Los Angeles at the time and would have connected the design to one already in place, such as this street in Santa Monica. In fact, the Olmsted brothers drew many options for street trees that would include a variety of canopies with many flowering trees. Here we see with this wide road, again, how far back these buildings were sited. The road would play many roles, including a destination for tourism. LA already had a legacy of auto tourism. This shot is in Eastlake in 1908. You could get what these strip maps, which would be a drive that you could take, and it gave you the mileage, where there were gas stations and things like that, where the roads were macadamized so that you can have a smoother ride. The routing of the parkways by the Olmsteds would take you by what they thought were the most beautiful areas in the region, such as the Rose Gardens at Exposition Park to Lemon Heights, where you could see that bucolic agricultural landscape. A new type of roadway was recommended for Los Angeles, one called a pleasure way, in which one could travel with pleasure through the region. These design roadways linked both natural and cultural elements for the driving public. One example is a San Fernando pleasure way, which allowed you to drive from the picturesque San Fernando Reservoir with its backdrop of the San Gabriel Mountains to Olive View Sanitarium, which is a beautiful Mediterranean structure and gardens. And then the drive would end at Pacoima Wash with its rugged and natural river setting. This period of regionalism was one in which Californians were celebrating their Spanish history. The parkways, therefore, were also directed by important historical places in the county, such as the San Fernando Mission. As I said, the Olmsted firm had already designed roads that managed stormwater in Palos Verdes. But Los Angeles is different and unusual. Most parkway projects in other parts of the country dealt with the normal behavior of a river. And that, what I mean by that, when we look at photos like this, is that the river flowed year-round and above ground. Perhaps the greatest challenge with water was working with the region's river hydrology, including the Los Angeles River, the Rio Hondo, and San Gabriel River. All these rivers were mostly unchanneled at the time, meaning that they were not yet in the concrete channels that we see today. To better understand the hydrology, this section view provides a good example. The stormwater comes off of the San Gabriel Mountains in an uncontrolled flow, and when it gets to this groundwater basin, the soils are really porous and the water goes underground. It's not until this basin is completely full that it resurfaces and flows out through Whittier Narrows, where there's a dam today to hold this water. In Los Angeles, both these images show normal river flow patterns. One when the river is subterranean, but when there are floods, the water surfaces and causes violent damage. Many newcomers to Los Angeles expected rivers that flowed above ground and would make the dangerous mistake of building in the floodplain, as did these people here. The Olmsted plan was to use eminent domain and move people to safety. As I said, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. knew that the LA River was an underground river. So like in Palos Verdes, in which the streets managed stormwater, his roadways along the river edges would do the same. The parkway easements along the river protected the river from development. And this is a drawing, this green right here, he drew on these maps to show where the parkway system would go. So the green is the width of the parkways with the LA River going down the center. So it would have kept it in its place. One of the most interesting maps I came across was this drainage plan for the Palos Verdes Parkway. We can see here's Palos Verdes, Hollywood Palos Verdes Parkway, and Sepulveda Parkway. And this map shows how they had planned to accommodate anticipated volume of water. Each of these numbers, which you can't see, is too small, but they carefully calculated the amount of predicted stormwater along the parkway, with the acreage kind of bounded into these areas here of dashed lines showing the local drainage areas. So they're designing the roads with an understanding of how much stormwater they would have to plan for. Since I have copies of the planting plans and the grading plans for the Palos Verdes Parkway system, my colleague Aaron Ligon and I have been modeling the unbuilt system to see whether its stormwater function would have worked. There is one basin, and this is in Redondo Beach, this parkway plan. And this area here is that area, and this area here is that area. The area here is the larger of the two basins. They were graded as vegetative basins that would retain water during rainstorm events. The larger basin in the center, well, this one over here actually, was designed so that it could become a future road. And guess what? Our models show that this design would have worked. Because of the greater volume of naturally flowing water and anticipated additional stormwater, in the design for Sepulveda Parkway, a wide drainage channel ran between the two border roads. So there's going to be a wide channel in here. And we can see it here and also here in these section views. So drawing its typical cross section, water would follow this low ditch within the channel. And should the drainage channel fill during large storm events, there are some drain inlets that would prevent damage to the parkway's pedestrian paths, motorway, bicycle route, etc., before harming any structures. Trees were planted within this channel and along its edges to help minimize erosion and stabilize the banks. And then culverts, in this map, it's got location of some culverts where it's a pipe under the road, were aided in the natural flow of water while allowing that circulation over the top of it. The lower San Gabriel River Parkway was another park with flood control design. Olmsted described this proposal in his report and says, the riverbed is several hundred feet wide, but under control may be narrowed and deepened, but it would destroy the not unpleasant tree-bordered wash that now exists. For a parkway, it would be better and more attractive to preserve much of the natural character of the present bed, to develop border roads and dikes farther apart in a less formal manner, and make some uses of this land in the bed of the stream during most of the year when little or no water is running. The firm researched the maximum width of river that the rivers needed for their natural flood patterns, and then they moved the roads to those edges. In this postcard, we can see the train tracks here, the river is here, but we also see the telltale pattern of how far that river, how wide that river can flow when it's really running high. So the park plan would have had multiple functions of being a motorway and recreation, but also flood control. With infrastructure located in the floodplain, Olmsted Jr. believed it'd be a relatively easy repair after inundation. And in fact, some parkways he called flood channel parkways. One was at the mouth of the San Gabriel River in Long Beach. We can see it right here where the water's flowing out, and there's two sections of parkway on either side that are several hundred feet wide. And he said that the parkways and the rivers should become a unit. So he thought of them as an ecological unit and should be designed together. Gardena Slough, which you can see on this map, and also here on this plan, where the LA River was too low in elevation to outlet to the ocean, pooled in a series of 3 lakes northeast of Wilmington, known as the Watson Lakes. Maps from 1930 recorded the vast extent of flooding patterns in the slough, you can see it here, with the red line showing the recommendation for a reservoir deep enough to hold back historic flooding of the area. So the reservoir would be located in this location. And because it was a marsh, this area was largely undeveloped, but the Olmsted brothers had a vision that would make it highly usable. As this landscape was subject to very rare but heavy flooding, Olmsted Jr. noted that the design could be used for park purposes, even if flooded. To make it usable, the marsh would be deepened into a lake, which provided recreation. You can see the lake right in here, with on the banks a boathouse, a bandstand, and also what he called meadow playfields located on the edges of the water, which could flood if necessary. The park was then bordered by parkways. And again, you see how wide these parkways were to protect the site from private development. At the time, Olmsted Jr.'s concern was that the county flood control engineers had underestimated the flood levels in this and other areas of low elevation. And he believed that during maximum rain years, the water levels could be 5 to 10 years, the estimated engineered figure. The design for Gardena Slough would mitigate for this type of flooding that occurred in 1938. This is a photo of the slough showing Redondo Beach Boulevard buried underwater, with the flood water spread over this property in the same patterns as those historic maps. So this disastrous 1938 flood not only killed many people, but it caused over $46 million of damage countywide. Like Palos Verdes, Olmsted Jr. made plans for saving open space in all of California, and he understood the relationship and balance of conservation with utilization of natural and constructed resources, from beaches to rivers to the connection of existing trails and proposed open space. So for the firm, they considered open space something that you strategically plan for to protect fragile ecosystems and sometimes mitigate for fire, all while offering recreation in these places. You can thank Olmsted Jr. for California's state park system. Through legislative action in 1927, a California State Park Commission was created. And one of its first acts was to hire Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to conduct a statewide survey to develop a list of areas to potentially become state parks. Olmsted wrote in the report that his intent was to determine which lands are suitable and desirable for the ultimate development of a comprehensive and well-balanced state park system, but also to think about conserving and utilizing scenic and recreational resources in the state. So he divided the state into 12 districts that were largely defined by topography and other physical conditions rather than jurisdictional boundaries. And without the use of GIS, he studied the state as a landscape to make these recommendations. He recruited his friends and clients to help, and the process began by making field studies to analyze views and their scenic qualities among a long list of attributes. Much the same way the landscape architect B. McHarg would do in the 1960s, Olmsted then inventoried lands both quantitatively and qualitatively, measuring the value of these qualities, such as plant and animal life, as well as landscape character, to come up with a point system. Sorry. He then whittled that list, he whittled that list down to 125 sites that then we see Prairie Creek State Park and also Morro Bay State Park becoming some of those early state parks that were saved. In this particular slide, saving land as state parks was one way of preserving invaluable landscapes, such as the ancient redwood forests. And here we can see the scale of this ancient tree as measured by this man in the foreground. At the time, those giant redwoods were being logged and clear cut for timber. Parks were categorized, these state parks were categorized by areas. They were either along the ocean, in the redwoods, and other big tree areas, along lakes and waterfalls, in the mountains, in the desert. Olmsted wanted to make sure that every Californian was within 1 day's drive of a state park. And at the time, California was able to buy the open space before it was developed. As much of the coastline was becoming privatized by the 1920s, perhaps within the mountainous regions, there could be prevention of that same kind of development to reserve these lands for public use. Strategic locations of new roads into open space, therefore it could have a dual purpose of the necessary roadways to view the scenery and allow for recreation, but they also provided access and mitigation as fire roads, something of special importance in today's climate. For Olmsted, the best example of environmental design and management of a state park was the Lower Sacramento River and Tributaries project. In this particular area, for more than 80 miles from Antioch to north of Marysville, river channels and strips of floodplain were enclosed by levees that were built by the state for flood protection along the edge of the river. So lining those levees were roads, also built and maintained by the state. So cars could travel on top of the high levees, looking at the beautiful view of the river and adjacent farmland, with the levees controlling flooding and protecting the riverbanks from erosion. And then along the course of the drive were areas for recreation, picnicking, and camping in a design that Olmsted Jr. called a vast river parkway. Now that single design managed a flood problem, commercial navigation problem, irrigation problem, with conservation and utilization of agriculture and industrial opportunities that seemed to come into this unusual balance, providing scenic and recreational amenities at the end. So in looking to the very last project I want to talk about, we're going to return to Los Angeles, and in combining all these projects, the Olmsted brothers developed what would have been a master plan for the Los Angeles region, one that conserved water and connected the city along its unchanneled rivers. When the firm was asked to develop a park system for Los Angeles, they're very familiar with the region by this point. It is one of the most ambitious park proposals developed by the firm at 1,500 square miles, and the Los Angeles rivers would play a major role. Their 1930 report was entitled Parks, Playgrounds, and Beaches for the Los Angeles Region, and was written in collaboration with the planning firm Bartholomew and Associates. 200 copies were printed and submitted to a citizens committee. As you'll see, in many ways, this design was that master plan for Los Angeles, because the city was developing without a master plan. In this drawing, the green represents the proposed plan, which you see as a series of parks and parkways. And then these red parks here were large reservations of open space in the mountains, the canyons, deserts, and islands as an extension of the park and parkway system. Like past projects, the design began with an intensive study of both the qualitative and quantitative elements from ecology, demographics, land use, railroad lines, highways, and zoning. The firm also mapped the cultural elements of the region, such as this area of Sherman Oaks with citrus orchards, and Signal Hill over here, an area with oil derricks. The design was clearly not constructed for those of you that were getting excited about this, but I think showing the design proposal really reveals an approach to urban design that factors in natural and cultural systems. The park and parkway system would work with many watersheds, from the Los Angeles watershed west to Santa Monica Bay, and then south into the Dominguez Channel. One fascinating discovery in using Olmsted Jr.'s hand-drawn maps of the region is that we can identify where the natural hydrology was draining. In these drawings are showing the parkway locations, and these lines right here are where the water is draining through each of these canyons, in this case from Angeles National Park or National Forest. From my research, I found out that Olmsted Jr. wrote the report. And within it, he compared the potential of Los Angeles to the Olmsted Brothers built projects in places like Boston, which is shown here, that Boston Back Bay tidal marshes. Some parks would be used recreationally, incorporating the rivers and their drainage problems into an aesthetic and useful design for active recreation, as well as public open space. For example, the Delray Marshes, which he alludes to, could become a waterside park like Boston's Back Bay tidal marsh. Other parks, he said, should remain passive for things like hiking or habitat protection. This was especially true where flooding occurred, such as at Tahunga Wash. Other options for the land at the base of these mountains where flooding occurred was to create sports fields, which wouldn't suffer from inundation. They would just be flooded. Floodways were set apart for handling those maximum floods, like this whole floodplain being left as open space, so the rivers could maintain a normal hydrologic patterns and percolate into that soil. Olmsted also showed a design for a beach, which you didn't really think of how to design for a beach, but you do as a landscape architect. During the work on state parks, he argued that the specific ecology of a landscape should be considered a unit, such as an ocean beach that extends from the low water surf to the upper limits or crests where the wave will wash materials onto the shore that forms the beach. So in this section drawing, he marks the high tide, and then he creates a pedestrian promenade if you didn't want to get sandy. And then there's a small border drive in here with a parking lot a little bit further back. And then a wider road with public transit in this space. And then private property all the way back this far. So with private property set this far back, ocean views were kept unobstructed and the natural tidal flow was maintained. Olmsted also looked for locations in the county where he could create these hybrid landscapes. That is, with the purchase of one property, you could have multiple uses. A single space could function both as a public swimming pool. This wouldn't happen after 9/11, but this one would be both a swimming pool and a distributing reservoir for the city water supply. Or you could trade a natural park lake like this one that's used for recreation and switch it to become also a needed reservoir. Also multi-use was he proposed for Bolsa Chica, which is in Huntington Beach, and what he called a marsh reservation to be both an estuary and a bird refuge. At that time, the site was being leased to Standard Oil, then Signal Oil for drilling. But if it was made a public space, its value would then extend beyond just that human use and consumption. In this plan for design in Palos Verdes, the property included open space, play fields, barbecue area, a plaza, all with ocean views, and they're adjacent to a golf course. So really maximizing that land use. One last thing about the plan, when I was doing my research, I wondered why this exact location of the park and parkway systems. So yes, ecological factors located the parks and parkways in certain areas, but why the others? Using GIS, I marked with these purple dots the location of Olmsted Brothers designs in the region. And sure enough, the park system would take you through or near their projects. The firm's still unbuilt projects like the parkways were added to open spaces for the master plan. And I truly believe that if the Los Angeles park proposal had been built, it would have created the legacy for Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., similar to the frequently cited Boston Park System design by his father and Charles Eliot. So, not to end on a sad note, I'll show you a couple more slides of a success story in California. So while Los Angeles didn't follow the Olmsted Brothers' advice to build a park system, the East Bay cities in Northern California did. Olmsted was hired to write a management report for this open space. And this was written at the exact same time as parks, playground, and beaches for the Los Angeles region. Within this, Olmsted proposed that the East Bay cities buy the ridge lines to prevent development and open them as recreational parks. In his report with Chief Forester Ansel F. Hall, Olmsted wrote that the East Bay communities face an unusual opportunity. Nature is placed within easy reach of this growing region, a contiguous border of scenic land, most of which is too rugged for industrial or extensive residential purposes, but possessed of a high recreational value. So this was a view of the bay from those East Bay lands. You can see the bay down in here. The Olmsted Hall report was a comprehensive survey of the recreational needs of the East Bay cities. And a lot of these were water district lands that they were then recommending what to do with the surplus land to adapt them to a park and a recreational system. The two consultants also recommended purchase of then privately owned land, which actually has been done today. That was both socially and economically expedient for the community concerned. And they said would complete the boundaries of these reservations. So while the East Bay district straddled 9 municipalities, Olmsted Jr. and Hall argued that the park reservations not follow those jurisdictional boundaries, but use ecological boundaries of a topographical unit. So thinking broadly about landscape. Like Los Angeles, the proposal incorporated these picturesque water elements such as reservoirs and lakes and abandoned dams. And it also used a lot of the same language from that Parks, Playground, and Beaches report, arguing really for the vital need for parks. These surplus water reservation areas then were left mostly in their open space conditions with carefully added roads and overlooks. So I see, wrapping up the last couple of slides. This is the area that was originally purchased, and it now includes Wildcat Canyon and Tilden Park. In this area of Oakland, we can see how much greenery is in that park system, even though it's extremely dense once you get into Oakland itself. These are views of Wildcat Canyon and Tilden Regional Park, which are both conserved while allowing for regional use. And this is my last slide. The designs by the Olmsteds focus on nature and culture, really bridging that relationship for human use. And they foresaw a lot of the looming ecological issues that were ahead and accounted for them, solving them with that design. The plan added green spaces throughout the county in a way that LA residents could interact in these landscapes in recreation and contemplation, scenic beauty. And the designs created new public spaces that were across socioeconomics and all demographics. Many of these landscapes that were recommended to preserve or conserve found champions in the later 20th century, as we can see with these examples here. So that is my final slide, and I apologize for going so far over.
That's okay. That was a great presentation. Thank you, Christine. I see a few people are dropping off, but we still have a pretty good number. So I'll go ahead and ask a few of the questions that have been coming in via the chat. And the first one is from Michael, and he asked, which trees did the Olmsteds use and how have they survived over time? And I'm not sure if this was specific to Palos Verdes or not.
Let's see. Without looking at my list, they use the oaks, they use, lots of eucalyptus. Oh, that's a really good question. They had palm trees in the parkway designs. They also included jacarandas and other flowering trees that they thought, oops, am I still there? Oh,
yep.
that they thought would create these beautiful spaces. Acacia was on that list. I should have anticipated this question, but they used a large number of trees, as I said, to show both the variants of canopies And most of those trees have survived, much to the chagrin of some of the Palos Verdes residents, because they have grown very tall and are sort of blocking views for neighbors. So there's a point of contention in those neighborhoods because of the trees.
Great. There was another question about which archives or special collections you consulted for your research, and I know that's come up a few times.
So one of the very best in this country is the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site. Michelle Clark, you might be on this call still. One of the archivists there, they have all of the not all of them, but they have a lot of the plans and the photographs already digitized. So you can go onto their site and see and download actually photographs of before pictures. There's also the Library of Congress. The Olmsted firm gave a lot of their correspondence to Library of Congress that then put them on microfilm reels. And so that's what I spent a lot of my time, was reel by reel, copying all those letters so I could read the design intention, because the firm wrote letters about every one of the projects. And then in this one, I also included the archives for the Palos Verdes Peninsula Library, who has a tremendous photograph collection. So I would highly advise, if you're doing any kind of research there, to go to that archives, another great one. But then there's ones that are scattered throughout the United States, because there's so many Olmsted Brother projects. So you'll find bits of individual projects within each of those cities.
There's a question from Ruth here that ends with, what role did Griffith Park play in the plan? And I think the plan she's referring to is the Parks, Playgrounds, and Beaches plan. Mm-hmm.
So the existing parks like Griffith Park were maintained. And what the Olmsteds always do is they try to put their parks next to existing green spaces, whether that's a cemetery or another park, because it just extends that green space a little bit more. So they kept all of the parks that were existing in Los Angeles and then added onto them with locations for new parks and parkways that connected between them.
Well, you are ready for all those questions. Have you compiled a tree list of all the trees that they used in their
I do have that
plans?
list.
Oh,
I do, because they at the Olmsted site too, in those letters, they've got all the plant lists. So you can get copies of all the plants that were used in their projects.
okay. Well, I think that was all of the questions, and I see we're down by a few dozen people. So it's 7:15. I'll go ahead and close tonight's presentation, but thank you, Christine.
You're very welcome.
Oh, I saw one last question come in. Maybe we can just address this one. Has
Okay.
there been an effort to recognize the Olmsted Brothers' work through a National Register thematic designation?
There are individual projects, yes. So let's see. I shouldn't say National Register. I know that I wrote the local one for Leimert Park, that's in Los Angeles. So I think people that are really concerned about preservation, writing those, it's more important to be defined, made into a local landmark, because whatever you write in that plan is its most important assets, then gets flagged in planning. And so the National Register is more of an honor than it is to prevent any kind of, or to kind of mitigate development. So I believe there have been, but I have personally written the local ones too, to preserve places.
Right. And as far as I'm aware, there's no sort of system evaluation, a cohesive look at the park system.
No, well,
Right.
I don't know. That's true. I don't know about the park system at all.
There is in Seattle, isn't there? A National Historic Landmark designation, or some sort of conservation designation for the parks, the Olmsted Park up there?
With the Volunteer Park and other ones like that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can't say exactly about those designations, but I know that there certainly is an appreciation for those parks, and a concern that they keep a lot of the historic aspects of them as they develop these parks too. Because they still have to change with modern needs, but keeping the important parts, the views, the architectural elements. I know up in Seattle, one of the reservoirs had to be capped after 9/11. So they created a really thin veneer over the top of the cap, so it still looked like the water feature, but was protecting the water supply from any kind of terrorism.
Oh, cool. All right, well, I'll end there. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us tonight. And there's another presentation scheduled for November, so keep an eye out for that email and check back on our website. Thanks, everybody.